It's Tuesday, January the 18th, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a Hoover Distinguished Policy Fellow. I'll be moderating today's show. That makes me the gateway to the stars of our show, Hoover's GoodFellows, as we jokingly refer to them. That would include the historian Niall Ferguson, the economist John Cochrane, the geostrategist Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, decidedly casually clad today, I might add. Looking good, HR. And today, gentlemen, we have a guest. We're going to talk about guns today, and joining us for our conversation is Charles C.W. Cooke, National Review's senior writer and co-host of the Mad Dogs and Englishmen podcast. Hey, we stole from Scorsese. He can steal from Joe Cocker, I guess. Charles is a graduate of the University of Oxford, where he studied modern history and politics. That explains the podcast title and his accent, as you'll soon hear. He moved to America in 2011, becoming a citizen in 2018 and taking up residence in what seems to be an increasingly crowded Florida. Charles, welcome to GoodFellows.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, guns. I did a little research for the show, Charles. Here's what I've learned. Apparently, there are 400 million or so guns in this country. There is no hard count. It's an estimate. That means that there are more guns than there are Americans. That means there are about 100 million more guns than there are cell phones or automobiles. If we break down gun ownership on a per capita basis, Charles, the United States is far ahead of second place Yemen, which is in the midst of a civil war for 7+ years. We are far ahead of third place Switzerland. Swiss men, after mandatory arms training for militia service, are allowed to keep service rifles at home. You've been here for 10 years, Charles, like Niall Ferguson, who came to our shores as well. You've studied our curious ways. What is unique about the relationship between Americans and guns?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Yemen, because normally when you compile lists with America at the top, the next country is Germany or France or Britain or Canada. And that is not the case. I mean, the United States is an outlier in the Anglosphere. It's an outlier, though, in that it has retained what was once considered to be a right in much of the Anglosphere. So, as is often the case in America, what you have here is the retention of classical liberalism that has been abandoned elsewhere. And it's slightly less stark, but America is also an outlier on speech. The First Amendment's protections are far, far stronger than you would find in Britain or Australia or South Africa, or what you will. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, just to sort of start things off. One is the Second Amendment clearly is written into the Constitution, and that makes a big difference in the way Americans see it. There was a legal protection of the right to bear arms in British law, but firstly, it wasn't applied to everyone. And secondly, it was chipped away over time. It was a law that had passed through Parliament, and as such, it was easily repealed. And the second difference is that because it's such a big country, because it had a frontier, and because it was so much more hostile and often less civilized than, say, Britain, by the time that gun control as an idea became debated, which it wasn't in the early Republic, which we can come on to, there were already so many guns in circulation that the prospect of picking them all up, as they tried to do in Australia and have largely done in Britain, was impossible.
All right. Well, Niall, you're also a newcomer. You've studied the American culture. What's your take on Americans and guns?
Well, I'm terrified of guns and always have been. I went to a school in Scotland where we had to shoot World War II rifles, and I was quite spectacularly bad at that. I've done my best to avoid firing guns throughout my life. I'm sort of the opposite of HR. And so I come to this debate as a sort of proven gunophobe. And the way I've come to think about this as an American, like Charles, naturalized American of British origin, is that the United States is kind of a social Darwinist society in practice. It's not explicit anymore, but it's essentially a place where there's just a higher risk of death from a whole variety of different sources than in most comparable developed countries. And if you compare it with Scandinavia or indeed Britain, you're going to get the wrong answer, because it's different. And it's not just guns that you're more likely to be shot by. It's clearly COVID that you're more likely to be killed by, and opioids that you're more likely to have an overdose from. And I could go on and on. And I think the key is just that Americans have a relatively high threshold when it comes to risk, higher certainly than West Europeans. When it comes to guns, it's much more like a Latin American country, as it's like a Latin American country in a bunch of other ways. Increasingly, it's politics. But whenever British people say to me, how can you stand to live in America where there's just a school shooting every other day and you're constantly dodging the bullets as you cross the street? I tell them two things. First of all, that really isn't the experience of life on the Stanford campus. The bullets I dodge here are metaphorical, not real. And secondly, Americans look at your cancer survival rates on the National Health Service, and they think you're pretty crazy. It's just that British people choose to die of badly diagnosed and badly treated cancer, and Americans prefer the risk of flying bullets.
Interesting. So 155 gun deaths in the UK last year, 40,175 gun deaths in the United States. John, in HR, does this mean that Americans simply have come to accept gun deaths as part of being an American?
I think it has a lot to do with the tradition and the history, as we've already been talking about. I'm visiting friends who are Canadians, and we were discussing this. What's the difference, right? Because we're both in North America, and I think it in large measure comes down to the fact that we gained our independence through armed resistance and a revolution, and of course, as Charlie's already mentioned, the frontier and the need to have the right to bear arms for sustenance as well as for defense, and the militia tradition that was associated really with the defense of the colonies even before the revolution. So as a historian, I think it has a cultural basis to it. But of course, because I've been handling weapons, my whole adult life, I don't think we ought to fear weapons. I think we ought to fear criminals who have them and people who don't know what the heck they're doing with them, untrained people with weapons.
Let me chime in. Once you bring up guns, it's a great way to start a fight, not a gunfight, but a verbal fight in a lot of America. When we were talking about this thing, I hope to steer us away from the minutia of the Talmudic reading of the Constitution that quickly.
Please don't. I want to talk about.
Okay, we'll get there. I want to sort of tee up some issues for us to then follow rather than just guns. So I'll, in deference to Neil, yes, we can let us historians especially debate exactly the 18th century use of commas in that clause. But really, what are the issues? There are two. Why do you want a gun in any way? Well, there's the question of self-defense against crime, and there is this question which we should talk about, which is bubbling under there about independence, militia, armed resistance to tyranny, and so forth. Let's focus first on crime. People say, you have to have guns to defend yourself against crime. And that seems to me once posed as a policy issue, not a traditions, constitution, and so forth issue. Kind of a curious way of putting it. First of all, of the 400 million guns, only one in a million is ever used to in a crime or to defend against a crime. The idea of get rid of the guns to stop the shooting makes no sense. Like everything, almost all of those guns just are never used for anything. But it does raise the question, why do Americans, let me pose the economic question, demand not just your right to have guns, but people have evidently shelled out a fair amount of money to have 400 million guns sitting around their houses. Why do Americans, rights or no rights, feel the need and desire to own quite so many guns? Well, it's a reason people want to own guns, because they live in violent neighborhoods. And a lot of effort on that, I think, would make, rather than fighting about the gun restrictions and trying to restrict supply, why are we not talking about demand? And perhaps gun ownership could retreat to something that is a right. There's a historical tradition, but one that most Americans don't feel the need to exercise.
Well, can I perhaps insist on a little historical background here? And I'd love to talk about the commas, because they seem like they're really important here.
Well, and Neil, take us to the historical background. I mean, this whole issue of resistance against tyranny is important too. English law had a lot of gun restrictions, and our framers were very unhappy about being told they couldn't hold guns for a lot of reasons.
All right, gentlemen, here is the exact language of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Quote, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of the free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Now, Charles Cooke, you are teaching an online course on the right to bear arms. You have looked at the historic nature of the Second Amendment. What is so complicated about those words?
Well, I don't think it is particularly complicated. I do understand why people are confused by it now. And if you go back through American history, you'll find legal scholars in the late 19th century warning against the coming misinterpretation of the Second Amendment, in particular, Thomas Cooley in 1892, in what was basically the default textbook of the time, says, here's what's going to happen. We're going to read this sentence and we're going to misunderstand it. But then he goes on to explain that the reference to a militia came in a debate over standing armies, and that the right pre-exists it. It's an imperfect analogy, but much in the way that you might pull a jury from the general population, you would pull a militia from a citizenry that was already presumed to be armed. And if you go back and you look at the Second Amendment, the argument against it protecting an individual right, which is a modern argument, seems to rest on the idea that the National Rifle Association and or Justice Scalia invented or misinterpreted this individual right in 2008 in the Heller decision. But the reason it doesn't make much sense is that the right to bear arms as a concept in American law was brought over from Britain, was well established before the Revolution, but was then instituted in many states before it hit the federal constitution. Pennsylvania, for example, puts a right to bear arms in its constitution. Vermont does 1 year later in the same document as it abolishes slavery. And by the time you get to the federal constitution, the real debate as it relates to individual rights is whether or not we needed a Bill of Rights at all. And when the anti-federalists win that argument and they prevail upon James Madison to include the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, that's really the price of admission, Madison says, well, I'm just going to include all of these individual rights we already agree on. And all the letters that go back and forth to the ratifying conventions seem to back that up. So I know we focus a lot on where the commas are and on the prefatory clause. Eugene Volote would point out prefatory clauses were actually fairly common at the time of the founding as explanatory strictures. It just wasn't the subject of very much debate at the time. And if you look at the way that it's explained during ratification and immediately afterwards, it is presumed to be an individual right. So I don't have much time for the dissenters in the Heller decision and a lot of journalists now who say, oh, it's a collective right. It's been misunderstood. James Madison, when he suggests the Second Amendment, which was originally the fourth, along with the First Amendment and what became Amendments 1 through 8, he wants to put them into the part of the Constitution dealing with individual rights. He wants to put it into the part of the Constitution, for example, that protects habeas corpus. He doesn't suggest putting it next to the militia clause. All of these little examples, they really militate in one direction. And I think it's important to start from there, because if we don't, we're applying modern gun control sensibilities to what was actually a debate over something profoundly different.
Okay, Charles, I have a question for you. Well, it's a two-part question. The first is about commas. There are clearly too many. And if one were to use modern punctuation, the Second Amendment would read, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's what it would be if a modern sub-editor got hold of it. But we don't have a well-regulated militia anymore, and it's no longer necessary to the security of the free state. So isn't, in that sense, the Second Amendment anachronistic?
You could certainly argue it's anachronistic, although again, because at the time the militia is drawn from the people who are presumed to have their own arms, the absence of a militia wouldn't undermine the existence of the right, because however you look at the commas or the prefatory clause, the right is still of the people. And everywhere else, right and people is used in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. It doesn't refer to anything collective, it refers to individuals. So sure, you could make that argument. That's more of a practical argument that now we have the police, do we really need this? That said, the Second Amendment, when it was being drafted, went through various iterations. So really, there are two questions in the minds of the founders. One is, how do we protect individual rights, such as the right to keep and bear arms? And the other is, what do we do about the prospect of a standing army? And it's a badly drafted amendment that tries to do both. The original draft actually said the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, semicolon, and then a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. In some states in the colonial era and post-revolutionary era, you see these concepts mixed up. In some, you don't. In some, you see the right being protected in defense of themselves, that being the people, and of the state. And that's a Lockean concept that was popular in the 18th century that really draws no philosophical distinction between you protecting yourself as an individual and you protecting yourself against tyranny. But I do agree it's badly drafted. Compared to the First Amendment, for example, it is not as clear. Although it is worth saying that is partly because our language has changed. I mean, well-regulated, for example, is used throughout Pride and Prejudice to describe Mr. Darcy's behavior. But I mean, I don't think anyone would say, well, the government is in charge of Mr. Darcy. So, we've changed what we mean by arms. We've changed what we mean by well-regulated. We've changed what we mean by militia. And so when you read it now, you think, what does this mean?
Can I ask, we're talking about Constitution and background, if we're going to read the language of it and the historical context, which included not just defense against burglars, but also it included militia use. It included historically lots of people, groups of people denied arms because they were being terrorized by other people. Where is the limiting principle? Why do I not have a right to an automatic weapon, a bazooka? I'd kind of like to have a fighter plane fully tricked out. At the time, was this understood to include the right to own cannon and a well-equipped sailing ship? How is there, if we're going to do it constitutionally and recognize this historical thing, where is the limiting principle?
So the first thing to say on that is it is, of course, difficult in the same way as it is with speech. And so when you go back to the original understanding, you have to use the terms of art from the time. So, for example, the freedom of speech, which the First Amendment protects, meant something more concrete in the 18th century. It was mostly understood as political speech. Now, I'm not saying the Supreme Court is wrong to have expanded this, but there is no way that any of the founders, any of the drafters of that amendment would have considered, say, a T-shirt full of profanity to be covered by the freedom of speech. And arms has a similar heritage where it means something concrete. And now arms is a much broader term. We would describe, for example, nuclear weapons as being arms. But in the 18th century, Scalia and Heller points to Black's Law Dictionary. It had a much narrower definition that was opposed to ordnance being bombs, shells, and so forth. This gets a bit complicated because in the early republic, private citizens did actually own ordnance and they also owned warships, but I don't think they were protected under the Second Amendment.
But if I may, bear arms has, at least to modern ears, a connotation of not just me individually and a burglar, but in an organized, it has an organization, a militia, something a good deal more serious than a little handgun and a mugger.
Well, it does and it doesn't. And there's a lot of use of bear arms in an individual context. There's a lot of use in military context. But traditionally, and I need to bring up the exact Black's Law Dictionary definition, but in the definition, it mentions rifles, carbines, pistols, daggers, It's difficult to draw a line if you're a court, but a good way of thinking about this, in my view, is anything that you can both carry on your own and discriminate with. So if you can carry it as a weapon, and if it's not, going to destroy huge numbers of people, then that is what was considered to be an arm, both in Britain and in the early Republic.
And Charlie, isn't the National Guard really the modern day manifestation of the militias? Back in the colonial period and the post independence period, and some of these state militias, right? That still exist outside completely of any kind of Department of Defense standards, and are affiliated only with that particular state.
Yeah, although Tench Coxe, who was a lawyer in Philadelphia at the time of ratification, wrote this explanation of the Second Amendment, which reads today as somewhat radical, where he talks about how the people should be able to overthrow the government if it becomes tyrannical, and he describes the militia as being everyone. I mean, now what he meant by that, of course, was men who were 21 or older, and in most states who were white, and we shouldn't gloss over the outrageous exclusions from constitutional protections that African Americans have suffered throughout American history. Although it is worth saying on that Justice Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, one of the reasons he doesn't want blacks, as he puts it, to become citizens is because he just assumes that if they're citizens, they will enjoy the right to bear arms and carry guns wherever they go. He says this in the opinion. But yeah, he saw the militia as being pretty much anyone. And this is, again, difficult for us to imagine because we have police. But back in the early Republic, you would pull people sort of from the street, not just if you needed to fight the government, which thankfully was rare, but if you needed to apprehend a criminal or a runaway or even a deserter. And the assumption there is that every man is armed, and that you could do that in a meaningful way. So yeah, I think the modern incarnation would be the National Guard, but historically it was something much broader than that.
It's worth saying, isn't it, Charlie, before we leave the history behind, that one of the sort of key moments in the American Revolution is the attempt by the British forces to take the armaments away from the Massachusetts Patriots. And in that sense, when all of this is being thought about, there's some very, very hot live history in people's minds.
Exactly. And the founders were aware of history outside of their own tradition. I mean, the Federalist Papers, they're full of references to the French and the Greeks and the Romans. And they see in all those cases that arms in the hands of the people would have made a difference. And so, yeah, when you get to 1775 and the British trying to take the stores in Massachusetts, then they think, aha, I've seen this movie before.
Did you ever go to see the Battle of Lexington reenactment, which is well worth doing? Have you ever done that? It's a great test of whether you're still British or not.
I have actually seen that, and I remember being told by the guy I went with that one of the problems is the number of trees, because they planted all these trees as some sort of conservation effort, but apparently at the time it was almost completely open because they cut them all down. So it's this false impression.
I was very challenged when I went to that reenactment, because when the Redcoats appear playing Men of Harlech, I immediately sided with them. But that was quite a while ago. And,
this is not such
hopefully you've overcome that.
I have overcome it, but it is. I mean, Charlie, let's face it. This is we should accept the kind of tension at the heart of being both a British and an American citizen, and it's nothing lays it more clearly bare than this issue.
This is not such ancient history. I want to stay with history as the economist. It's not such ancient history as we're talking about. And you've written about this. Where did a lot of gun control come from in the United States? The desire of white people, especially in the South, to keep blacks from owning guns, and so that they could be terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan, by organized armed groups. The desire to have guns would then be to not just not just you one-on-one against a burglar, but to have the kind of weaponry that could start, when we talk about the armed posse that's going to round up criminals, well, there were armed posses out there to round up quite innocent Black people and do horrible things to them. This is not so far in our history. And it is, if we talk about all the National Guard, well, then it's not clear pretty clear which side the state National Guard was on in that one as well. I think that brings up, we like to think, oh yes, all this government tyranny and defend yourself against it is ancient history, but I think it's quite an uncomfortably recent fact. It's an uncomfortable fact for arms people who want to have arms restrictions. It is a fact right now that many Blacks and other minorities are buying guns like crazy because they're faced with a wave of crime this time, not fortunately a wave of Ku Klux Klan. On the other hand, we Americans start to get all weepy about, yes, defend yourself against tyranny and the peasants in England who were disarmed against the landlords and so forth. But places around the world where people are defending their political rights violently don't look particularly nice. They are full of horrible violence. And Neil brought up Northern Ireland when we were talking about this earlier. There's a place where people were, as they thought about it, owning weapons to defend their political rights, and that's certainly not a particularly good. So I think this is the most problematic part of the whole question.
I remember growing up in Glasgow in the 1970s, we were very happy that there were no rifles in circulation because of course, what was going on in Northern Ireland, where the sectarian division that was absolutely a part of life in Glasgow had become the basis for something close to civil war. So that's part of what informs my skepticism, I suppose, about widespread gun ownership. But here's the thing we haven't really grasped the nettle of yet. Public opinion in the United States veers around on this issue, but the latest poll suggests that more than half of Americans think there's a problem and that there needs to be some greater restriction, even if they disagree about what form that should take. So leaving the history behind for just a little, at least, let's talk about how things are today, because there's certainly a widespread sentiment, but far from universal, but a pretty widespread sentiment that we have a problem. And I'm inclined to think that we do have a problem. And it's not just, I don't just think that when there's a school shooting or when there's a mass shooting. I generally think there's a problem. But I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Charles, and what you think, if anything, needs to be changed.
Well, I am, as a practical matter, skeptical of a great deal of gun control, because I think when you start with 400 million guns and an individual right, the likelihood that whatever you try is going to help is fairly slim. And that skepticism is compounded by the fact that of those 40,000 deaths every year that were mentioned, the majority, nearly 2/3, are suicides. And that doesn't, of course, mean that those deaths don't matter, far from it. But America does not have a particularly high suicide rate. And it's about the same as France's. It's lower than Cuba's. It's half of Japan's. It's less than half of South Korea's. And although there is conflicting evidence on this, there's not a huge amount of data that suggests that guns make suicides more prevalent. They certainly make them easier, but you run very quickly into the problem of substitution. It's a thorny area. So I think really the bigger question is, what could you do that would work within the Second Amendment? And we've done quite a lot of it. That's my view. We have background checks on commercial sales. We have, about 20,000 laws at the federal and state level governing the purchase and ownership and use of guns. And what we have discovered over the last 30 or 40 years is that many of the assumptions that drove Americans to a far more gun control friendly position than they now have in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s is wrong. That being that if you have more guns in circulation and you loosen the laws that regulate them, that you will see more crime, more death, and more violence. And it's just not true. The number of guns in the United States in 1990 was about 190 million. Now it's 400 million. In 1990, it was difficult in all but about 10 states to get a concealed carry permit. Now every state has a concealed carry permit system, and only 8 of them really restrict it. Almost every state either has a shall issue regime where anyone who's over the age of 21 can get a carry permit, or they don't have any permits at all. There's now 22 states, I think it's be 25 by the end of the year, that don't have any systems at all. And what we've seen over that period, and I'm not suggesting, incidentally, that this is a causation, but what we've seen over that period is a dramatic drop in crime and a dramatic drop in gun crime. And every time that, say, the Rand Corporation looks at all of the evidence here that comes from left and right, pro and anti, they throw their hands up and say, we don't know, we just can't see any patterns. And as a result, I am somewhat skeptical of measures. I'm not closed-minded. I'm interested to debate them. But I have a frustration with the political debate in this area, because whatever happens, the party in this country that wants more gun control, on balance, the Democrats, argue for the same stuff. So if a guy who is not allowed to own a gun walks into a gun-free zone and murders people with a pistol, the first thing you will hear from Chuck Schumer is, we need to ban AR-15s, regulate concealed carry, and put in universal background checks on private sales. And usually none of those 3 ideas, which are trotted out every single time, even intersect with what has happened. And I think that really matters, because my suspicion is that if the Democratic Party, which I think earnestly wants to improve this situation, by and large, had an idea that it believed would work, and that was related to the inputs that we see, it would have proposed it. And my conclusion is it doesn't know what to do either.
I echo, as much of our political system seems to have continually the same answer, always in search of different questions. And that's exactly the tendency you just pointed out. Now, let us define what the question is, and then maybe the answers will become clearer. If the question is reduce the number of people who die from gunshots in the U.S., once we could agree on that, then I think you're exactly right. The answers become fairly obvious. Simply reducing the supply of guns, the number of guns outstanding in the U.S., isn't going to make any difference. Why? You put up the numbers. There's 400 million guns. You said 440,000 people get shot by guns. Mm-hmm. So a quick division, 1 in 100,000 guns gets actually used to shoot a person. Just that reducing the supply, it's going to take a long time before that makes any difference. Of course, the last people to give up the guns are going to be the ones who want to use them to shoot. So it's not that we have a gun problem, it's that we have a crime problem. Now that does suggest that there are things we could do, and not so much on the supply of guns. Again, if you're trying to restrict all but 1 out of 100,000 that don't get shot each year, that's a lot of bureaucracy to restrict the one that does get used to shoot someone each year. But in America, it could be the case that using a gun in a crime or to shoot someone could much more reliably lead to consequences. Isn't that the answer? Which is, not. Again, I cited the number of 20% of murders get solved, but many more guns are used in crimes and don't lead to bad outcomes. So I guess this is a tired talking point. Enforce the laws we have, but I always think in terms of demand and supply. Enforce the laws we have so that the people who like to shoot people with guns have much less of an incentive to do so. That seems like there are many avenues for fixing that incentive other than just trying to reduce the numbers of guns, given the overwhelming numbers of guns that never get used for anything.
Yeah, can we talk a bit about that, Charles? I have the impression that, and it's a while since I looked at the statistics, that a really large proportion of the guns that we know are out there are owned by a relatively small number of people who amass enormous arsenals for their own personal gratification. And I've seen some of these arsenals. Texan friends, I'm thinking about you. And so there's a kind of slight delusion if you talk to people in Europe about this, that, I mean, every American is packing heat, but actually there's a huge skew in gun ownership, isn't there?
Right. That's true. Although it's still relatively common for Americans to own guns, and increasingly so, especially in the last 2 years, the number of households with guns has increased, and different sorts of people have started buying guns as well. The statistics that we have are quite difficult to parse because a lot of them rely upon self-identification. And for example, if the General Social Survey calls you up and says, "Hi, I'm from the federal government. Do you have any guns?" There are quite a lot of people who are not going to say yes. So, that number is probably under 50%, but not that much under 50%. But, that to me is interesting, especially when it relates to, say, suicides. But beyond that, I don't think it particularly intersects with the problem, because most mass shooters buy their guns from a shop. They go through a background check and then they go and do what they were going to do because they weren't on the radar before. And most criminals buy their guns on the black market. And, we do have an awful lot of systems in place to try and stop guns from making their way onto the black market. But as was just said, one of the problems is we're really, really bad at enforcing those laws. And New York historically has been good at enforcing those laws, although now they apparently have decided to give up on enforcing laws at all. But cities such as Chicago, which have a real problem with gun violence, and also that lead to illegal gun trafficking throughout the Midwest, they don't do it. Kevin Williamson, my colleague, has written a great deal about this. They overlook straw purchasing and gun trafficking in favor of other more serious crimes, and that's where the vast majority of guns used in crimes come from. It's not the 35 to 45% of people who have a gun in their house.
Can we talk a bit about the purchases during the pandemic? I want to make a couple of confessions. The first is that I'm the only person on the GoodFellows team to have fired a firearm live during a show. And it was during the pandemic when I was based in Montana and a woodpecker was attacking my largely wooden house. I'm going to have to interrupt my contribution to shoot a woodpecker. Yeah, a woodpecker, because right now, if you listen, you can hear it drilling a hole in the wall of my house. This is Montana living, and I think it's important that we share the experience with our viewers. So here goes.
So we've established that a year from now, Niall Ferguson is going to be in jail for shooting birds.
Well, Neil is showing off his Second Amendment stuff, which you can't do in Scotland.
I missed. The second confession is, and it illustrates an important thing about life in a state like Montana, that I was one of those people who bought firearms during the pandemic. And it was a kind of subtle social pressure that led me to do it, where my local friends were saying to me, "Wait, you don't have any guns?" And I felt socially at a great disadvantage. I said, "Well, no." And they said, "Well, you can't live here and not have guns," like I was a simpleton. I mean, there are bears, there are all these critters trying to eat your house. And I found myself within a very short space of time the proud owner of two really quite fearsome firearms, which are now securely locked in a cabinet that I almost never even go near. But I really am interested in what led people to buy so many weapons in 2020 and I think it continued into 21. I haven't looked at the numbers recently. There was a huge spike in purchases of guns. I'm not sure that many people bought them out of social embarrassment like me. But what was going on there? And I do distinctly remember conversations during the peak of the protests following George Floyd's death. Although there was not the slightest unrest in the neighborhood where we were living, I do remember conversations about what you'd be doing if things really got out of hand. In America, I can remember those conversations. So talk a bit about that, because it's a fascinating moment in American history.
Well, let me step in for 1 second here, Neil. Which state in America has the highest percentage of gun owners in its population?
Charlie should know that.
Montana.
Alaska.
Is it Montana?
66%. California's about 28%. And let me build on Neil's question here. It's a great question. 5 million more Americans became gun owners during the pandemic. This show, by the way, is a product of the pandemic. We've also seen, Charles, a rise in gun ownership among minorities, Black, Hispanics, and Asians. Is this due to personal safety? Is this a product of defund the police? There's also the political element, the joke that when Democrats come into power, the first thing you should do is invest in gun stock because guns always go up in their values. What's actually going on here?
I think all of those things. And I also think the pandemic made people feel a little bit like a prepper. That it was the closest that we'd come. I mean, my parents are British and they're anti-gun, and they couldn't be gun owners in Britain if they wanted to. But at Christmas, my mum said that they'd had a conversation at the beginning of the pandemic and said, well, what happens if this is the big one, if this is the end of the world? And my mum had said, well, it will be fine because they grow all their own vegetables in the garden, and so they would have food. And my dad said, he'd said to her, well, it won't be fine because I'm 74 and you're 69. And if it's the end of the world and people realize that we have a food supply in the garden, they'll just come and take it. And he said, for the first time, we thought, well, there's a way of getting around that, but it's not available to us. Now, they don't want to buy guns, don't get me wrong. But it had occurred to them that they might be somewhat at risk. And I think it occurred to quite a good number of other people as well. And when you combine that with the riots that we saw and the feeling that the police were pulling back, I think you could easily get to 5 million people deciding to invest in a backup plan.
Yeah, it's not bears, Neil. I've lived in the south side of Chicago before this time, but during times of unrest, and we considered the possibility when we called the cops once because we thought there was a burglar, and the cops made sure to get there about an hour later. The cops never want to show up while the action, and that's, I think, the central. Why do people, especially in poor neighborhoods, especially Blacks and the minorities, why are they buying guns? Because when they call the cops, if the cops show up at all, the cops show up an hour later. And if you want, we talk about the government as monopoly violence and so forth. Well, exercise your bloody monopoly. I'm back to lower demand. It's very clear why people demand guns for personal safety, because the state isn't providing personal safety anymore. Rather than talk about gun control, I think, I'm going to go back to lower the demand for it. And we thought about it too. So you were off in Montana, and there was a protest right out in front of our house. And it was, in our case, a very peaceful protest because it was all the well-thinking white people of Palo Alto out there protesting. We're far, far away from the people they pretend to care about. But nonetheless, there's nothing quite like a completely cop-free, quite loud protest going by your front door to remind you what things are like. And the videos of the quite violent protests that you can find on the internet, where people were attacked, people were beaten to death. There's this question about, are you allowed to use guns to defend property, which some people tried to and some people didn't. But nonetheless, that feeling of crime going out, but then also social unrest, large gangs of people coming after you. I think that has been a big incentive towards the demand for guns, which is where we ought to be talking, not the supply.
HR, you've been notably quiet, but it seems to me that it's time we got some expert insight from the member of the team who's fired the most rounds. It seems to me one of the issues here is civilians with insufficient training getting their hands on the kind of weapons that only a skilled soldier should be handling. Tell us a bit about how much training you think it's necessary for someone to have before they own a firearm.
Well, there has to be just basic safety training, right? I mean, and this is, you have to know how to load, unload, clear a weapon. You should also be familiar on how to, disassemble it and clean it and reassemble it. And then you have to get some experience actually shooting it. You have to learn some of the, the fundamentals of, muzzle discipline and especially, clear your weapon. And the accidents that you see that occur infrequently in the military because of the training emphasis typically are those that involve someone not properly clearing a weapon system. And then, of course, you want to be smart about what weapon you get. You want to get a weapon for the purpose. If you're hunting, you want a decent hunting weapon. You also want to look at the safety features on that weapon to make sure that it does have a really strong manual safe as well as other safety features that could prevent an accident. But I think that training should be part of the program. And Charlie, I'd like to ask you, what do you think? What exists now in legislation in terms of safety courses? Are they required when you buy a weapon? I think if you're gonna, if you have to take motorcycle safety class to get on a motorcycle, it makes sense to me that you would also have to take a weapons safety class.
Well, it depends on the state. The problem is that the difference between states that have safety rules as a condition of either purchasing a firearm or getting a carry permit, and the states that don't is negligible, if not non-existent. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen a flowering of so-called constitutional carry states in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, there was one, Vermont. It had been one since 1777. That's how the Constitution had been interpreted. No such thing as a permit to buy, own, or carry a firearm. And that was joined first by Alaska in 2003, and then by Arizona in 2010. And then the floodgates opened. And now more than 60% of the American landmass is in constitutional carry states. And there's just no difference between states that have training regimes and states that don't. And it sounds counterintuitive, but that's one reason why it's spread out. And I remember when I moved to Florida, I was shocked that I didn't have to have my car inspected. In Britain, you have to have your car inspected. It's called an MOT. And in the Northeast, you often have to have your car inspected. And I looked into why, and all the statistics said it doesn't actually make much difference. So Florida dropped it. And it does seem to be the case. I think if there were a big difference, I would be a lot more strongly in favor of having training attached to the dissemination of concealed carry permits. But given that there isn't, it just looks to me like putting obstacles in people's way and charging them money for a permit that isn't doing very much. So I'm on the constitutional carry side of this, but on pragmatic rather than ideological grounds.
I just remember speaking at the funeral for my fellow fourth grader who was killed by a weapon in a household because the weapon was not cleared
right.
and the ammunition was not secured. So I just think it's not about people endangering themselves. It is to a certain degree, but it's about them endangering others if they're unfamiliar, with weapons. And I just think it makes sense to do it. The other issue that's related, I think, to gun control or or policy, but I don't know what the remedy would be or what the truth is even, Charles. But a lot of the cartels from Mexico import drugs to the United States and export weapons, back into Mexico. Are there any policies that could be in place to maybe restrict the illegal weapons trade that is actually contributing to the cycle of violence and insecurity in Mexico and in Central America associated with narcotics trafficking?
I mean, the main thing I would say again is enforce the laws that we have, because we do have quite a lot of laws in this area that the ban on straw purchasing is designed precisely to prevent weapons from being bought in stores in bulk, handed off to people for whom they weren't intended, and then traded to criminals. And we're just really, really bad. And I will say something for Jeff Sessions, of whom I wasn't an enormous fan. He increased prosecutions for straw purchases by 30 or 40%. And the Biden administration has dropped the ball. It's not as simple as Republicans v. Democrats, but that was a really good move that the Trump administration took, and it's gone by the wayside.
Let me put in a couple of pot shots here. Sorry for the inappropriate metaphor. One is perhaps training is good for safety. When I read these events, I'm astounded at how bad the marksmanship of most Americans is. So perhaps training would be counterproductive, and that people would be more likely to hit what they're trying to shoot at. That was a joke. In this discussion of being able to have weapons for personal protection, that doesn't argue against registration, against knowing who has the guns, being able to trace back where every bullet came from, and accountability for misusing the guns. Yet a lot of the anti-gun control, a lot of what you referred to as the constitutional, I forget what the word was, moments, those are against, even knowing who has the guns and accountability for how you use the guns. Third little pot shot, I would be curious to hear about other countries that have a great deal of gun ownership and much less misuse. Switzerland, Israel, Finland. Granted, these people get to own automatic weapons, and yet there's a whole lot less mayhem with it. And finally, drugs. I'll just be the libertarian economist again. We've created this illegal, extremely violent gun trade. We've created a demand for weapons. We've created narco states south of the border with insane drugs, drug control laws. And are we really, yes, people wasting their lives on heroin isn't such a great deal, but is the enormous amount of carnage and destruction of so many countries really worth it?
So I'm profoundly against gun registration, and I'll explain why. The ideological argument, if you like, which is also a practical argument, is that if the government doesn't know who has guns and where those guns are and what those guns are, then it can't confiscate them.
No, but let me quickly. So this is very important. This is the question of, are guns there for your protection against crime, or are guns there for your protection against the government and to threaten an insurrection if your liberties are...
Well, no, but I don't think it implicates that. It's an important distinction, but I don't think the gun registration question implicates that. If a government is unable to look at a list and work out where the 400 million guns in circulation are, then it can't take them away, irrespective of whether the people who own them would have any need to fight that government. That is, if you are opposed to gun control, a good thing. So I don't want to make it easier for governments to take away guns, even if I don't think I'll ever have to fight that government. But
yeah, I'm just arguing for you need to have consequence. If you misuse a gun, there's a very quick and reliable consequence for it, and we're not at that point.
Well, we're not, but I would just say on another practical level, the reason we have almost no gun registries left in the United States is they don't do anything, and that's why Canada got rid of its long gun registry. It's why New Zealand got rid of its gun registry. Chicago got rid of its gun registry. None of these jurisdictions could point to a single crime that had been solved or helped by the existence of the gun registry. And in Canada, especially, the law, I believe, when it was passed, was supposed to cost 20 million Canadian dollars, and it cost 2 billion. And eventually, the Western states and provinces in Canada said, "No, this is enough." In terms of consequences, I do agree with you. I mean, for example, I don't know to what extent or how you would write this law if you wanted a law. But one thing I've noticed here in North Florida is the police often put out messaging saying, please, for the love of God, lock your car at night. And the reason for that is huge numbers of North Floridians have guns and they keep them in their car. In fact, in Florida, you don't need a permit to keep a gun in your car because under the law, your car is regarded as an extension of your home. And that is where an awful lot of criminals in North Florida get their guns too, because they break into the car, they take the gun out of the glove box, and then they've got a gun. There are no criminal penalties whatsoever for leaving your car unlocked on the street overnight with a gun in the glove box. And on the one hand, I think it's difficult to punish people for being the victim of a crime. I mean, if somebody breaks into my house and steals a gun, should I be held liable for that? On the other hand, I do think that culturally, it's really important to prevail upon people that they should keep their weapons secure, whether that's in their car or in their home. And it doesn't bother me in the slightest that the police and the sheriff's department around here, repeatedly tells people to do this. There was a case of the 15-year-old, I think he was in Michigan, who shot his classmates about 2 or 3 weeks ago, maybe slightly more. His parents essentially availed him of that gun. They were charged. I saw people saying they were overcharged. They weren't. They should go to prison. I mean, a 15-year-old is not allowed a gun. We're not talking here about an adult. The idea that you could leave a gun lying around and then that you would not be held culpable for your child taking it to school and shooting people, to me, is absolutely absurd. And I would support strict penalties of that sort in every state in the union. So I do agree with you in principle. I just think gun registries are the wrong way to go about it.
We're getting short on time here, so let me throw a question to the group, and that is the Second Amendment. Here in America, if the Second Amendment is no more, Charles and group, what happens? Would blue states around America immediately seize guns? How would that be effectively done without bloodshed, without violence? What about red states? Would everybody owning a gun now want to flock to Florida and Texas? But then we look around the world, the geopolitics of the Second Amendment. What if there was a Second Amendment in Ukraine or Taiwan, let's say, a country that either has an oppressive country or is looking at being invaded? Does that change the geopolitical order at all?
Well, I can't see a scenario in which the Second Amendment would be removed or any such drastic constitutional change would occur. So I'm going to regard that first question as a non-event. I think when you ask the question, and this is kind of more challenging, would Putin be able to rule Russia in the way that he does if there were a Russian Second Amendment? It gets into more interesting territory. Now, I'd love to hear Charles's thoughts on this. My sense is that Russia's political history is so profoundly different that it's very difficult to imagine how the Russian government at any point in its history would have been okay with the Second Amendment. So you have to kind of imagine a parallel universe where Russian history unfolds completely differently, beginning at around about the time of Peter the Great. But Charles, what are your thoughts on this? And do you have good examples of historical outcomes that would have been different with American-style gun ownership?
Well, quickly on the first question, if the Second Amendment went away, and we're assuming that the federal government is allowed to regulate firearms, which I don't think it is, but I'm a holdout on this, you would still have 45 states with state-level Second Amendment equivalents. So you would probably see more strict gun control in, say, California, which doesn't have one. But in most states, they would run into the same legal challenges as they do under the Second Amendment. And in fact, probably stricter challenges as well, because some of the states have much stronger Second Amendments than the one in the federal Constitution. On the second question, I mean, this is, of course, the big question, because whenever you say, well, we should all have firearms in case the government turns tyrannical, people say either that will never happen. Okay, may I introduce you to the 20th century? Or that there's nothing that a well-armed population could do against modern fighting force. And I mean, that sounds convincing superficially until you look at what a whole bunch of peasants with light arms did in Vietnam and in Afghanistan and Iraq. And unless you believe that, say, the American government would be more brutal with its own population than it was prepared to be abroad, which I don't, I do think in a Western country, the existence of that many guns probably is an ultimate check. Would that apply to Russia? Would that apply to Taiwan? That's quite difficult to answer. I do know that when the Second World War broke out, there was a committee in part aided by the nascent National Rifle Association, which sent hundreds of thousands of guns to Britain for the Home Guard. A lot of those guns came from American citizens who shipped them over because in the 1930s and at the outbreak of the war, the British government actually collected up an awful lot of guns, partly to use in the war effort and partly to make sure there was no, what would we put it, revolt among the population. So clearly they thought that it would be beneficial, albeit not so that the British could fight their own government, but so that they could fight if there were an invasion. I just really ultimately come down to what is probably partly a philosophical question, which is, well, do you believe that individuals, whether in their own home or living under a tyranny, have the right to try? And I know this wasn't the question, but I find all too often people who are opposed to the Second Amendment, they start by saying, well, it wouldn't help you if the American government became a tyranny. And I don't think that's the important question. I mean, I don't need to prove to the government that I can win an argument to claim the First Amendment as a right. I don't need to prove that my religion or lack of religion is true in order to claim my religious liberty as a right. The point that has been made by defenders of the right to keep and bear arms since the Emperor Justinian is that you as an individual have the right to try to defend your own life. And if you die in the Warsaw Ghetto trying, okay. But I don't believe that governments have the right to take that away from you. And I would much rather be sitting in North Florida with my AR-15 than I would in Kiev, or I would in Taiwan, because at least I'd have a shot. And to me, that's why it is protected, because really the Second Amendment is an auxiliary right. The real right is to self-defense. And the argument has been for a long time that if you have a right to self-defense, you have to have an auxiliary right to the tools of self-defense, because otherwise you have a survival of the fittest situation. Otherwise, if you're a 5'2" woman, you don't really have any capacity to defend yourself. But if you are a 5'2" woman with a Glock, then you have a fighting chance against a big man. And I think that is a noble principle, and I'm glad it's enshrined into American law.
I'll just add I'm chiming in on the same points. Notice that totalitarians are unwilling to find out that you're. So if you make the argument, oh, well, nobody could resist against a modern state. Well, Vladimir Putin's not about to let us find out if his citizens can resist against the totalitarian state. As you mentioned, yes, they put HR and his buddies and a couple tanks in charge, and they can steamroller us. But most governments are not willing to slaughter their own citizens. So you have the ability to put up a fuss against a government that's, even the Soviets in the end were unwilling to do it. So that force, I think we see empirically that force is there. There's the problem of defending against yourself against tyranny also means the possibilities of civil wars, which are very unpleasant. And I think we've sat on that tension for an hour and will continue to do so. And my last comment will be where I started. I don't think the Second Amendment is anywhere near as binding as we are talking about. As you noted, there's a whole lot of state amendments and state laws. There's the desire of people to have guns, and they will express that desire when they vote for politicians. And when we find it convenient to ignore constitutional provisions, as in the economic arena, we just blast them beyond and forget all about them. So it is the continuing, as the First Amendment, it is the continuing popular understanding that these are our rights that makes them our rights, not something written on some piece of parchment 200 years ago that everybody bows to.
HR, why don't we close out here? This all sounds like the price of being part of a republic. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk out in rural Nevada, and it was a fundraiser that day. And what they had a raffle for was an AR-15. And there it sat in the middle of the field. It vanished at one point. Nobody blinked an eye. People were walking around during the day wearing pistols as sidearms. Nobody batted an eye. If any of us did this in downtown Palo Alto, we'd be in a world of hurt, I think. And I think if we opened up a gun firing range at University in Palo Alto, who would imagine what would happen? But the point here, HR, is we're a culture, we're a republic that's balanced this way, which you can do in California, you can't do in Texas, vice versa. So how do we as a people learn to live with this balance? People who want guns, who are comfortable with guns, versus people who are gunophobes.
Yeah, I think it's just respect for each other's rights, and I think that we express our desires by voting in people who are going to protect our rights if we're concerned about them. And I think that one of the things that bothers me these days is every debate is so vitriolic, I think, because it seems as if people are assuming they have no agency, right? And I think that what we have to recognize is if you don't like it, then mobilize a political effort and make your vote known and change the law, change the policy through those you elect to office. So I think that there's just a great deal of intolerance these days. I think much of it is tied to a lack of a sense of agency.
All right, John, does that mean with your libertarian sensibilities? Neil, does that mean with your gunophobe sensibilities?
Well, I'm just going to end by pointing out that it is not, in fact, Yemen that comes second to the United States in gun ownership per capita. It is the Falkland Islands. And if that doesn't allow us Brits to understand the American position a bit better, then nothing will.
And I will say though, there is a long history of successful partisan defensive movements, and especially, within the context of World War II in Southeastern Europe. The Finns, of course, are a classic example. So, but I think even the Russians during Operation Barbarossa, and their ability to operate in the forest against attacking German forces. So I think there are a lot of positive examples of an armed citizenry for being effective, and I think this does apply to Taiwan. And I think it would make sense to make Taiwan indigestible, not just with shoulder-fired weapons, but maybe even from the police having air defense weapons and so forth.
Charles, you were kind enough to tolerate all of us for the past hour. Why don't you close out, give us some final thoughts?
No, well, thank you so much for having me. This was great. I still think it's odd that I talk about this as much as I do, given that I was strongly opposed to the private ownership of arms. I think I broadly shared Neil's perspective on it, and I think you said fear of guns, and I thought Americans were quite mad. What really got me interested in this was that I came to believe that modern politicians were lying about the historical question. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great sin, not only because you shouldn't lie about the law or history, but because if you do, then you don't understand your country or the world as well as you should. And my aim within the gun debate started with that historical question, and then transcended it. The more I lived here, I actually came to believe that the economic question was much more complicated than I'd thought. That you can't just round up 400 million guns. That you can't treat people like widgets. But I think probably that the best thing to say in closing is to echo what John said, and that is that despite all of the attention on the wording of the Second Amendment, it is not why the right to bear arms has undergone a renaissance. The reason the right to bear arms has undergone a renaissance is because the American public demanded it. Every single major change in American gun policy over the last 30 years, at the state level and at the federal level, came from public opinion and pressure on politicians. It is just not the case that the American public is clamoring for radical change and the courts keep striking it down. Despite the Second Amendment having been upheld as an individual right at the court has taken almost no cases. It's largely ignored it. The lower courts have also ignored the question, and yet gun rights have trundled on at the local and state level. And that just says something profound for better or for worse about the American character.
And Charles, you have an online course, The Right to Bear Arms, the history of that. Where do I find that? How would I sign up?
So it's with an outfit called Chapter, which is a startup that They describe it as like a book club, but more fun. So it goes by week. You can find that on their website, which is at getchapter.app. Or if you can't find that, you could go to my website, which is charlescwcooke.com, or you could just look me up on Twitter, and it's pinned at the top of the page.
Okay. And I assume Neil has an open invitation to visit you in Florida and go shooting.
Of course, anytime.
Charles Cooke, thanks for joining us today. Gentlemen, thanks for a great conversation. That's it for this installment of GoodFellows. On behalf of my colleagues, Niall Ferguson, H.R. McMaster, John Cochrane, our special guest today, Charles C.W. Cooke, we hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for tuning in. Till we meet again, take care.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring H.R. McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.
I narrowly missed the woodpecker, but it was a difficult shot.